Dr. Tom Stinson joins me now to talk a little bit about the forecast. Dr. Stinson, thanks for joining us on Capitol Report.
Well, it's good to be here.
Let's begin with, the governor essentially encapsulated this forecast by saying there's some good, some bad, and a lot of uncertainty. So let's kind of go through the good first.
Well, the good is that we have more money in 2012, 2013, the current biennium. And while that money isn't available to be spent in 2014, it's required to be used to buy back the school age shift. It does buy back the school age shift, and that's important because, among other things, it begins to build the hidden reserves back that the state has in case we go into a serious economic problem again.
And the bad?
Well, the bad is a matter of degree, but I think everybody would like to have some money to spend in 2014, 2015, and instead we're still about $1.1 billion in the hole. And so that leaves a pretty difficult task for the governor and the legislature.
We'll get to the uncertainty, also known as the so-called fiscal cliff, in just a few moments. But first, I did want to get your reaction to Speaker-designate Paul Thiessen. He said, every time we have a deficit, we fail to face reality. So in your opinion, what is the reality with this budget forecast?
Well, the reality that economists and budgeteers think is that we've got to get into a situation where current expenditures and current revenues are equal. And in the past, what we've done is figured out some way to shift some money from the future into the current biennium, or to do some magical smoke and mirrors like the tobacco bonds, which doesn't solve the problem in a fundamental way. All it does is just push the problem into the next year or the next biennium.
Let's, and I want to get back to that in just a few moments, but we really do need to address the idea of the fiscal cliff and what's going on in Washington. You did essentially a second forecast based on this fiscal cliff, and just kind of explain to us what the worst case scenario could be if there isn't some agreement in Washington, D.C.
Well, the worst case scenario, and this isn't just me, this is most economists and most forecasters say that if there isn't some fundamental agreement on what to do about the combination of tax increases and spending cuts that are all scheduled to take effect January 1, 2013, we're in a recession. We're in a recession in the first quarter of 2013. That means that the economy in January, February, and March of next year, in other words, a month from now, 2 months from now, 3 months from now, doesn't grow, that it actually shrinks. So that's the worst case scenario. That's the risk that we have. For the country as a whole, what we're talking about is going from the current unemployment rate to a 9% unemployment rate. We're talking about losing, compared to where we would be, about 3.5 million jobs. So, you know, we're not kidding around here. This is big time stuff. The fiscal cliff descriptions and discussions that you hear, they're really real.
Understanding that you're a numbers guy and not necessarily somebody who studies consumer behavior constantly, is just the idea that there could be another recession enough to get consumers to maybe quit spending now in fear of what could happen? And if so, could that impact the budget even if Congress comes to an agreement?
Oh, I think that's exactly right. You sound like an economist now here.
That's scary.
What the concern is a lot of people say, well, it doesn't matter. This isn't really a cliff. It's just a slope that we're on, and we could put off solving the problem for 2 weeks or a month or 2 months or 3 months and not go into fiscal cliff. But econometric models aren't very good at incorporating changes in consumer attitudes into what's going on in the economy. And if you go a week or 2 weeks, people's attitudes are going to change. They're going to say suddenly things are a little more risky than I thought they were. They cut back on their spending. If they cut back on their spending, then pretty soon it affects the number of hours somebody works in a week, and then pretty soon it affects jobs, and then it spirals out of control.
Okay, so I want to ask you, understanding again that you don't necessarily work with the legislature, you are the numbers guy, but would you agree that there needs to be some reform in the tax structure?
Yeah, I think both at the federal level and at the state level, most public finance economists would say that the tax structure needs to be reformed. I'll give you just a simple example, and that is that in Minnesota, we have grown increasingly reliant upon the capital gains, and capital gains are very volatile. You probably don't know this, but we're predicting capital gains to go up by more than 50% in 2012 and then fall by about 50% in 2013. When you have that kind of volatility, it makes state finances much more unstable. So one of the things that we need to be thinking about is how do we increase the stability of state finances? That state finances, state revenues have gotten to be much more volatile than they were 20 years ago. So we had the Latimer Commission in the 1980s where we looked comprehensively at taxes. It's about time that we have some comprehensive look at tax systems again. I mean, 20 years, 25 years, that's not a rush to change things.
And members of both parties would agree with you that there needs to be some reform in the structure. However, how that is handled obviously depends on which side of the aisle you're on. So with the governor saying that he's done with gimmicks, he's done with these games and the smoke and mirrors, and the commissioner saying there are now some tough decisions to make, some heavy lifting to do fiscally, you know, it's up to the legislature to start the process. And I know you don't like to do this, but I'm going to ask you anyway. If they were to come to you for advice, what advice would you give them on how to create a structurally sound tax system or revenue system, revenue stream?
You know, I think that we have to be concerned about having a broader base and not be carving out narrow pieces for individual self-interest. We need a broader base on the individual income tax, but of course we can't do that unless the federal income tax is changed, because it's important to have conformity with the federal tax. So if there is tax reform activity at the federal level, we kind of get automatic reform at the state level just by our conformity. And we probably need to have a broader sales tax base as well. That it used to be that we were, the younger people, we were younger and we bought a lot more consumer durables, big ticket items. Now that part of our tax base isn't growing as fast as it used to because I already have a refrigerator, I already have a stove, I already have a TV set, actually 2 TV sets, and so we need to get reliant on something other than those purchases of big ticket items for the sales tax base.
Okay, Dr. Tom Stinson, thank you so much for joining us today. We always appreciate your time.
Good to talk to you.